In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a content delivery network in Azure. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Seraltos. In this video, I'm going to walk you through setting up a content delivery network or CDN in Azure. I'm also going to show you how to add a custom domain name to the CDN and also add a free SSL certificate. Before that, please take a second to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified when I post new content. This helps me know that these videos are being watched and appreciated. Before we get started with the demo, let's go over what a CDN is and why companies big and small may want to use one. A CDN copies and caches content from a website or source closer to the user. Let's take a look at how this works. Say you have a website in North America. Users in South America and Africa request that content. The CDN will pull down and cache the content closer to the users. When the next user requests the same content, that content comes from the cache local copy. I'm going to use a full sample static website offered by Microsoft in my demo to illustrate how the CDN works. It's more common, however, to use a CDN to distribute part of a website, such as large files, image, or media. Think of Netflix and how it can use a CDN to get the movies closer to the users, reducing latency and global bandwidth usage. You can see how large multinational companies can take advantage of caching to get content closer to users, but even smaller organizations can leverage a CDN. Say you host a website with a few large files. Usage peaks for a couple hours each day, and that slows down the internet connection. You could increase bandwidth, but then you would pay for increased bandwidth 24/7, when you just need it for a couple hours each day. By moving large files to the CDN, you can minimize the impact on your internet connection during those peak hours, and the CDN is charged by usage, not by provision bandwidth or a set monthly fee. Let's move on to the demo to see how this is all set up. Buckle up everyone, it's demo time. Let's get started with an overview of what I'm going to cover here. First, we're going to create a resource group and a storage account. I'll probably create that in one step just because it's easier. And then I'm going to go on to create the CDN. Creating the CDN consists of two steps. I'm first going to create a CDN profile. A CDN profile is a collection of the same type of endpoints such as Verizon or Azure. The endpoint is the actual mapping between the URL, the public URL, and the content you're providing. Once that's done, I'll test connectivity. Then we'll go on to review the features available within the CDN. And then I'm going to add a custom domain and finally enable SSL. Here I am at the portal. So I'm going to first create a storage account. There it is. So I'll click on that and then I'll create. I'll select my subscription. And as I said before, I'm going to create a new resource group for all of the stuff we're creating today. Okay. Then I'll give the storage account a name. There we go. And I'll add this to Central US. I'll leave it on the standard tier, as well as make sure it's a storage v2. Now this would work with storage version 1, but there's another step that I'm going to do in another video that uses Event Grid, and that will need storage version 2. So I'm going to leave it at storage version 2. And then I'm going to change this just to locally redundant storage. You can keep it at whatever you want, but for testing, locally redundant is fine. And we'll leave this default. I'm not going to add tags. And once that's done, we'll create it. Let's move on. The storage account's been created. The next step is to create a container that I'm going to store my content in. So I'm going to go into blobs and I'm going to add a new container. And I will call this source. And one thing you will need to do is change this to blob, anonymous read access for blobs only, or you could do containers as well. I'm going to do blob. We have to set this because the content we're providing has to be available to the public. And if I have the source content set for private, the CDN won't be able to grab that content and distribute it throughout the globe. So wherever you're putting the content in the blob, that you want to be part of the CDN has to be publicly accessible. Next, we're going to create the CDN. Now, I could go up here and go CDN, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is come right down here to Azure CDN. I can create a CDN straight from the storage account. This makes it really convenient and easy to make sure everything's mapped correctly and in place. To configure the CDN, I'm going to create a new profile name, and you can hover over these little eyes if you need more explanation, but basically the profile is a collection of like endpoints or the same endpoint type. For example, Azure is one endpoint type, Verizon is another. I'm going to give it a name. We'll give it a name like that. And then pricing tier. Here are the different versions. And there are different features and pricing available for each. You can click on this link and get more information about each. But for what I'm doing, I'm going to use the standard Microsoft. And now we have to give the endpoint a name. This is the host name and domain that will be used to access the content. And this has to be globally unique. So you can see I'm the only one with that name. And the origin host name, that's the origin or the distribution point of the content. Or in this case, the storage account we're using. Now I'll click Create and give it a second to configure this. Great, now the CDN is up and running, but you know what? I don't have anything to really publish or test with. So what I'm going to do, I don't have it, I found this. This is a static website Microsoft makes available for testing. It's just a simple static HTML web page that you can put out for testing different endpoints. So I'm going to download this and upload the content to the source container on my storage account. And that should give me a web page that I can hit just to make sure everything's working. To upload files, we're going to come into Microsoft Storage Explorer. And down here you can see, not that one. Here we go. This is the blob container we set up. I'm going to go into blobs. We'll click on source. And with that, I should be able to just drag and drop all these files over that I need. There they are. I got them already selected. So this is the CSS font image JS folder, as well as the index.html. So if I just copy those right in, there they go. Okay, so the files are uploaded. And again, I just got this from downloading the content at this website. I'll put that in the links below. And then unzipping it and uploading it into the source container I created. If we go into blobs, we can go into source and we should see that content there. There it is. Okay, so that exists. So let's go back into CDN. And I'm going to click on my host name. And let's see if it works. Just copy this and go back here. Okay, well, no, of course it didn't. One thing to keep in mind, CDNs aren't a web server. So a web server will do things like you can create virtual directories, do path mapping. You can set default file names. So for example, if somebody doesn't put index.html, it will still open that page for them. This is a CDN. It doesn't have those features. It's really all about delivering content from a specific path to an end user. So I need to go source and index. And you can see that maps the container and the file name. Let's hope it works. There we go. It does. Good. So now we're pointing at that index.html that I uploaded into that storage container. It's not coming from the storage container though. It's not like I enabled static web content on the storage container. I haven't done that. This is all coming through the CDN. All right, congratulations. If you've made it this far, you have a working CDN. Let's go back over here and take a look at some of the options that we have. And I'm just going to run through these quick, and I'll go into a couple of them in a little bit more detail. But you have the overview. You can add the custom domain from here. You can stop and delete and purge. Let's talk about purge for a second. So imagine that you're hosting content throughout the globe and you need to change a CSS file because of and maybe a couple of images because of some content change. The CDN is a caching technology, so it's going to store copies of these files locally and not necessarily refresh every time somebody connects. There may be an instance where you need to rapidly or quickly update that content out on all these caches. That's what purge is. The simplest thing you can do is purge all, and that's going to delete the content off the cache on all the devices and load new. So if you are doing an update on the content in the CDN, you can upload it to the storage account and then you can purge. That will, in essence, refresh the content out on the CDN. You can also assign a custom path if you wanted to just purge one file. And that takes a couple minutes to run. I'm not going to do it, so I really don't need to at this point. These others are standard Azure options. I'm going to go into origin. So the origin type is storage, and we have the origin host header. And if you have a path you want to define as the root, you can set that. So for example, I could change that to /source, and then I don't have to add that to the end of the URL. And this is allowing HTTP and HTTPS content. Custom domains is where you can, again, add a custom domain. Compression is the compression used on the different files. You just want to leave that on unless you have some reason to turn that off. There's caching rules as well. I'm going to leave this all standard, but know that it's there in case you need it. Geofiltering is kind of interesting. You can block specific regions. Let's try one. Oops, there we go. So you have a list of regions you can do. You can block from accessing the CDN if that's what you want to do. Optimization is, I'm just setting it for general web delivery. The options available for the CDN depend on the type of CDN you selected earlier. Again, we selected Microsoft Azure. There's Verizon Standard Premium and a couple others in there. The rest of it is pretty standard stuff, so I'm not going to go into that. Next, let's move on to setting up a custom domain. So I'm going to do that from, you guessed it, custom domain. I'm going to add a domain. And I want to call this CDN2. Okay, so that's the host name that I want, but it's giving me an error and I can't add it. So what is it telling me? It's telling me that I need to define a DNS record that points my Ceraltos.com or CDN2.Ceraltos.com to the endpoint host name. So Microsoft's doing a validation to make sure whatever you enter here as your custom host name maps to the endpoint name. This is a security feature, so people can't set up fake endpoints or try to claim something that isn't theirs. This step is also going to be used in another validation for creating an SSL certificate and a few other steps. So I'm going to take a break at this point to create a DNS entry that will point cdn2.ceraltos.com at the CDN endpoint host name. That's going to be done with a CNAME record, as it's pointing out in here. Now, every DNS provider is a little different in how they do it, but typically there's an option where you can point a host name with a CNAME record at a given custom domain name. So if you have problems with that, do consult your DNS provider's documentation. That should have pretty clear instructions on how to do it. So with that, I'm going to pause it, and I'll be back in a second once that's added and replicated across the globe. Okay, we're back. Let's see if that's replicated. And there we go. I just had to do a quick refresh there, and now it's showing up correctly. So with that, I'm going to add. And that will add my custom domain name. Let's do a refresh and see if we can get that to show up. There it is. Okay, now that that's added, let's see if it works. Here we are at the web browser. Let's just paste this in. I already have it here. And the first thing we'll notice is if I try to access this path with the new host name, I get a message that this does not support HTTP. And one thing I'll point out here is in the account name, that's actually the storage account. So if we go back here and we look at overview, origin, there we go. It shows here that the CDN will support both encrypted and non-encrypted HTTP and HTTPS traffic, but the storage account will not. So let's go back into the storage account and we'll see why. If I go to configuration, this box here says secure transfer required enabled. So it is requiring secure transfer, which is HTTPS. If I click that and save, I'll come over here and let's try it again. There we go. So now it is working. I see one of the images didn't pull up. That could be just because I made a change just a couple seconds ago. We'll switch this to enabled, back to where it was before. Now if I come over here, and what if I just put HTTPS? It gives me an error. And if we look at the certificate is still coming from the CDN original name, AzureEdge.net. Okay, so at this point, if I want to use a custom domain name, I either have to use HTTP or I have to add a certificate. If I need to use SSL, so HTTPS, but I don't want to add a certificate, I'll have to use the AzureEdge.net domain to access this. But that's okay because we are going to add a certificate next. So let's go back into the endpoint. And in order to enable SSL, we're going to go into custom domains. And here we can turn it off or on. There's two ways of adding certificates into the CDN. One is to bring your own certificate. This is a little bit more expensive and a little bit more complicated. It's expensive because you have to buy a certificate. It's a little bit more complicated because you have to put the certificate along with passkeys into the key vault, and then you have to add the CDN as an application with rights into that key vault and rights to the certificate. That would also require rotating those certificates every year or 3 years or 5 years, however long you have the certificate for. So I'm going to do it the other way, which is using the Microsoft certificate. Here, I'll just turn this on. It's actually called the CDN Managed. So here you can see if I select use my own certificate, it gives you some steps that you have to take. There's some pretty good documentation. Some people may need to use their own certificate if it's just a requirement for your organization. It's not really that difficult, and nor is it really that expensive. But compared to the way I'm going to show you, it is a little bit more difficult. So with the CDN Managed, Microsoft partnered with DigiCert to provide free SSL certificates for their managed CDN. So that's the process I'm going to walk through. So I'm going to click Save now that I have it configured for On and CDN Managed. So what this is doing now is it's going to submit the request, it's going to validate the domain, and then it's going to provision the certificate. Okay, there it went to domain validation. And that brings up a good point. The way that Microsoft validates these domains is by that CNAME entry. So previously we set up a CNAME, and by adding a CNAME to my DNS records, that proves that I have control of that DNS record. Therefore, I am who I say I am. That's what Microsoft and DigiCert is relying on for the validation process. Now, what if you had a problem with that? Maybe it just didn't work, or maybe you change or remove that CNAME for some reason. The next step you'll do is it's going to email whoever, whatever email address is assigned to the whois information. And most people put their whois information to private mode, so that won't work. In addition to emailing the person registered to the domain, they will also email these addresses I have up here. So my point being is that before you get to the validation step, you may want to consider making sure you know who has access to these email addresses, or add it as an alias to your own email address. That way, if the CNAME validation step fails, you'll be able to approve it by email. Okay, so I'm going to let that run. The process took me, on the last one that I did, about an hour. And I clicked save, and I didn't mean to. I wasn't going to provision a certificate because I just don't need it for this test. But oh well, you can see now you can see how it works. And once it's done, it'll just provision the certificate. So I'll show you another one that I have. If I just remove the 2 off from here. Same website, but you can see here it's using the cdn.mydomain.com. I'm pointing to the same path. This is just a different endpoint. Let's go in and take a look at that. It was all set up the exact same way. Here it is. Let's go to the endpoint. We can see the host name, the cdn.ceraltos.com. And if we go into custom domains, there it is. That's what it looks like when it's done. So by just enabling the CNAME lookup or making sure you have access to one of those email addresses, you can easily provision a SSL cert for free to your CDN network. When I submitted this one, it did take about an hour, hour and a half to fully provision. So just be aware that it's not instantaneous. It does take some time, but it's all pretty much automatic. So that's it. Now I have a fully provisioned CDN using a custom domain name and a free SSL cert. So that's pretty awesome. That is it for my demo. That is it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Please take a second to subscribe, and thanks for watching.